Seattle area, and I represented tribal governments. So I mostly sued the US. And then I was around the startup world for a long time. I was on the board of one of Jonathan's previous startups and just really loved all the innovation that I was seeing, the collaboration. So I decided I wanted to jump into that as well. So I left law and Jonathan and I started working together. So we co-founded Customer Illuminated, which is what we're going to talk about today. And we consult with startups and tech companies on primarily customer discovery. And we use customer interviews to help them find product market fit.
Yeah. And some quick background on me. So I studied cognitive science of religion in grad school. So why people believe what they believe. And that ended up leading me to develop a background in applied decision science and behavioral economics. And then I got into the startup world and have consulted with a bunch of startups and entrepreneurial organizations around the world, and then founded some companies myself and took a startup through Techstars, which is an accelerator, and with like everything good and bad that goes with startup accelerators. So yeah, I've just been around it for a long time, and we've both been around it for a long time and seen a lot of things go well and seen a lot of mistakes. And so we'll talk about customer discovery. That's what we focus on a lot, but just a heads up, like if we can ever help anyone in this class in any way in the startup world or tech world, know that we're down and we'd love to just chat, help however we can. So.
And I'm gonna be rude and pop a ginger pill because I'm pregnant and it's the nausea stage and it's kicking my ass. Am I allowed to say ass? Sorry.
This is
Congratulations. Yeah. That's awesome.
Thanks.
Yeah, it's really exciting. So we're going to trade off talking about some things. And Meg said you all have talked a lot in the past about interviewing. So we're just going to chat for a minute about why we see it as critical. So whenever we're launching a new, and please just like interrupt and ask questions, or if there are questions, maybe whichever one is not talking, we can keep an eye on the chat.
Definitely.
So if there's anything that's not clear, please just throw it in the chat and then we'll try to answer it. And we'll have a longer Q&A at the end after we do some breakout sessions. But so whenever we're launching new products or services, we're making a ton of decisions under uncertainty, obviously. So at a very high level, I know you all have done different value proposition canvases, business model canvases, things along those lines. But some of the really high level questions we typically focus on are, what progress do customers want from this product? Who has that type of desire for progress? So who should be targeted? Is that desire a high enough priority to get customers' attention? So if this is like priority number 10, most people won't give you money for it. What's the competition? How do customers perceive that competition? How do we position against that competition effectively? What features make a product or service effective? All the kind of typical stuff that goes into whether or not a business will succeed or fail. And often when we are launching a new product or service, we can feel overly confident as founders that we have a good idea of what it should look like. And we get overly confident on the supply side and don't necessarily understand the demand side with a lot of clarity. So that's what our consultancy does. It helps with the understanding the demand side. What is it that customers actually do and think? How do they behave in the wild? I'll pause there.
And there are two ways to answer all of those questions that Jonathan just talked about. One is to guess and just make it up as you go. A lot of people do that because it's unclear what else to do, and it feels intuitively satisfying. But there's another way. So the other way is to ask potential customers, and they will just tell you. Humans like to talk about what they like, what they dislike. People really like to complain about unsolved problems. So they will share what it is they like and don't like and love about whatever band or app or product. So we think that the second way is a much better approach than guessing. Human minds are built to use good information to improve decision making. And so when you collect meaningful information, it's much easier to make a better decision.
Yeah. So we have a few examples of just using interviews in the wild. But I'm going to pause. Is there anything we should address? Any questions or anything? If nothing pops up. Okay, cool. Yeah, so just 3 examples. So I had a mentor who has founded 7 companies that are all worth more than $1 billion. And he starts each company by interviewing 100 potential customers in a month. And with his most recent company, he started out interviewing 100 customers in a month. By day 17 of the month, he went out and raised $14 million. That company is now worth $30 billion. He just doesn't move anything until he's interviewed a ton of potential customers, which money's not the only way, obviously, to evaluate success. But yeah, it is one way. We have another client who does diversity training for big corporations. And they built what they call, I'm not just insulting them, they built the wrong product for the wrong people when they first started. And then they ended up using interviews and going, oh, okay, crap, we have been targeting the wrong people with a product that they don't actually want to buy, and that's why sales is so challenging. And they pivoted, created a new product. And this is like a later stage startup with a lot of funding and stuff. Created a new product, targeted the right people, and started moving way faster. So yeah, see, a good question. I'm going to give this last example and then throw to that. So, and another was a company that I founded that we thought was doing really well. So this is the company we took through Techstars, and we had funding and a good team and a product that works. So this is a digital healthcare startup. Doctors and patients were using it. It's used to help make critical decisions about cancer treatment and depression treatment, all that kind of stuff. And then we interviewed a bunch of potential paying customers, not end users. So doctors and patients were end users. And the paying customers were health system executives and insurance company executives. And all of their financial incentives ran against adopting our product. So we had put years into this thing and had a working product out in the wild that people were using. And we decided to shutter the company. And so there's a lot in terms of how to get the order right of when do we interview, how do we interview, how do we do all that efficiently, which is what we'll go through more today. But I want to look at this question. Let's see, how do those interviews vary over that 100 people, over that month or whatever time, if they vary? That's a really good question. I think it's one that we're about to answer, actually. So you anticipated it perfectly. It's in our outline. So yeah, we'll just chat about that and then make sure it's addressed.
Yeah, if it's not clear, please tell us.
Yeah,
and we'll reiterate. So how to interview. So some quick principles on that, and this will go through kind of who those interviews are with and things. So we prefer a 4-stage process, and the first 3 of those phases are what we call discovery, and then the last stage is what we call validation. So I'm going to talk through the discovery phases. So the first stage of discovery is figuring out whom to interview. And the way that we do that, we think about it like another one of our mentors talked about it like a cocktail party. So you invite a bunch of people, you interview a bunch of people, and you chat with them for a fairly short period of time about somewhat general things to get an idea about who's interesting. Who do you want to speak with more? So when you're at a cocktail party, you kind of survey the lay of the land and, do some kind of surface talk to figure out, wait, do I want to have an in-depth conversation with this person? And we do the same thing with discovery. So we interview a really broad spectrum of people at the beginning to figure out who really has the problem we're trying to address. What are some targeting criteria that we can use?
Who has budget to pay for this kind of thing?
Yep.
Who's really enthusiastic and already trying to solve the problems on their own. So those can be 10 to 20 minute interviews. They're just quick chats. across the whole, as broad of a market as we can get.
Mhm.
And then we start using that to segment and target after that.
Yeah. So the first phase is you interview the kind of the broadest spectrum of folks there, and then you figure out your targeting criteria. And the second phase is about why people are interested in, a potential solution to whatever issue they have. What progress are they trying to make? And this works without a product or with a product. But how it works without a product is that we ask for stories. So you all mentioned something recently where you attended and talked about how important stories are, and that's definitely true with interviews. So we ask for stories about progress we think this product we sort of have ideas about in our head can help with. And if there's a real desire for progress, there's going to be competition for that. And competition can take several different forms. So, some people might be doing nothing. Like when Airbnb first started, their competition was do nothing, because the folks that were their first customers couldn't afford hotels, but they wanted to travel. They had this problem. They were just not traveling because they couldn't afford the options that existed. Or it might be a different product, or it might be a homegrown solution, which is what we call when somebody builds their own solution and kind of hacks something together.
So we have a friend who runs a construction company that's growing really quickly, and there's no software that matches what they need to happen. And so they've just built this Rube Goldberg machine of like 15 different softwares, right? That can all be plugged into each other modularly to try to solve the problems that they have with their workflow. So if there were 5,000 construction companies all doing that same thing, that's a really attractive market to go in and say, hey, we can just build software that does that sort of thing.
Because there's a lot of cost in putting that together yourself and switching between all of these different platforms. And then we also, at this stage, learn about positioning. And so what do folks like or dislike about the current approach that they're taking? And then that tells you how to position against that competition. And the third phase gets into the product itself. So prior to this phase, we haven't talked about a product with these people at all.
Mm-hmm.
So it's only the third phase that gets into what are product features that folks want, what are pricing schemes that they're familiar with, that they're comfortable with, what are their adoption patterns for similar products or products that could take similar decision making, like similar price range, that kind of thing. And then we can use the competition and past products that folks have adopted to understand their behavior with our potential product. Mm-hmm. So again, we focus on similar products and services they've used recently. How did they come to adopt those? What was the pricing on those products like? And what did they choose not to adopt and why? Those are really critical questions.
And then with validation, once we have all that information, which can come very quickly, it might come in 10 interviews, 25 interviews, whatever, it might come in 60 or 80 interviews. But once we feel like we're confident that we really understand the market's behavioral patterns, then we go out and we validate and we say, okay, we believe X, Y, and Z are true. If we make a product that does this and has these features and is priced this way, and if we articulate value this way, right? So we're positioning effectively against competition, we believe that these specific target customers will want to buy it, right? And so then we go out and we try to prove ourselves wrong, really. And I think that's one of the things that decision science has helped us with, is that a lot of startup founders, entrepreneurs, people working in the tech world, whoever's applying this process, often go out and they say, okay, let me make sure I'm right. And that can be a little bit dangerous unless you need to build up your confidence. But it's really easy to drink our own juice and convince ourselves, like we're constantly telling everyone, this is why this is a good idea, this is why it's important, this is why it's going to impact people's lives positively. And we can convince ourselves that that stuff is true. And so what we go out and do is we say, like, this is the best evidence-based hypothesis we can generate. But we need the market to prove to us that it's true. by saying they actually will adopt. So we'll do things like conditional letters of intent, where we say, if we hit these success criteria, you will adopt the product and pay, for a commercial license or whatever. So we can go into detail on any of those things. We're going to give some quick tips on how to interview without introducing a bunch of bias into the interviews. But before, I wrote a note for Art in response to your question. Aside from the phases that we have, those phases, we iterate a ton. So we'll learn, okay, these questions really don't land. 3 interviewees in a row have just not understood what it is that we're asking. Let's adapt the question and see if someone, if people tell us more interesting stories. So the whole thing is iterative. Each interview we end up running through a process at the end where we say, how could the questions be better? How could I be better as an interviewer? What did I miss that they said? So by the end of the interview process, we've got a lot dialed, and we're asking really interesting questions.
And we improve the targeting criteria over the course of the interviews too. So, at each phase and really throughout each phase, we're adding to what we think makes our ideal customer profile, essentially.
Totally. And then question about the interviews are iterative. Do you use prototypes of the offering? And maybe in phase 4, exactly. Phase 4 is when we do prototypes. Just because we could build product, and I see prototyping as starting to build product. We can do that in a knowledge vacuum, or once we start to have knowledge of what it is that people want. And so it's just a lot faster once we know, hey, this is what people want. These are the kind of features they're looking for. Let's prototype that out and see if that helps them buy. And of course, most of our clients have already built and launched products, and then they've failed, and then they're coming to us. So it's not like you can't do this with a product. It's just that we go about it in terms of learning what the customer needs and behavior patterns are in advance, and then go back and say, okay, let's rework the product in this way or that way, or let's tweak the prototype. That makes sense?
Yeah. And do we want to talk about test cards?
Oh, I think that, yeah. Was that a question or just a connection with a past experience? Is it Tara? Let's see. Connections to past.
Cool.
Okay, cool.
Great.
But yep, I think that's a good connection to me. So yeah, how to interview to avoid confirmation bias. And for those of us who haven't geeked out on behavioral economics for a long time, confirmation bias is just looking for evidence that confirms what we already believe, right? Which is rampant right now in the world anyway, but can be really rampant when we're testing products. But it's a good thing to avoid just in life, obviously.
A lot of what we're saying really applies to any sort of relationship or relationship with reality.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, we find ourselves becoming better humans whenever we're running a bunch of interviews. We just ask a lot of questions of the people we're talking with. So how to interview to avoid confirmation bias. So yeah, one overarching principle is ask for stories about the past. Never ask about predictions about the future. Never ask for predictions about the future. So the best predictor of future behavior, will you purchase this thing, or will you adopt this, or will you join us in an organizing movement? Whatever you're designing, it doesn't have to be a product or service, right? If you're trying to get people to join you, recent past behavior is really predictive of future behavior, and speculation isn't predictive of real world behavior really at all, which is, kind of hard to get through our heads because we love to speculate as humans. I love to speculate as a human. So if you're in an interview and the interviewee starts speculating, people would be interested in something that did that. We gently steer them back to their personal experience. So we'll say, have you ever found yourself in that situation? Or what did you do when you were in that situation yourself? Right, so let's see. How do you choose how to frame up? Which way to ask about recent past behavior? What types of trends are you looking at as comparable and useful content? Great question. So I think it depends on the phase. So usually if we're trying to understand the progress that the customer is trying to make, right? So let's say with the diversity training product, we would say something like, have you ever tried to run diversity training at your company? Just really simple, or in the past 3 months, if we can scope it with time, that's even better. In the past 3 months, have you tried any diversity training with your company? What went well? What didn't go well, right? What happened when you did that? So it's just really simple and straightforward. We hypothesize about what we think the product can do, and then we just ask them if they've ever tried to do that. Not like, do you want a product that does it, but have you ever tried to do this thing, right? So interviewing healthcare executives, I would ask them, have you ever tried to reduce the cost of care? Have you ever tried to help patients save money on their care, right? So it's sort of the value proposition is the starting point, the progress the customers are trying to make. And then you just ask for stories that get at whether or not they've ever tried to achieve that value. Does that answer the question? Cool. So yeah, just more on how to get good stories out of people. If the interviewee isn't really sharing details or they've forgotten details, it's good to jog their memory. So you can say, what time of year was it? What time of day was it? Were you working with anyone else on that project? Right? Like just things that help people start to remember, oh yeah, this is what was going on.
Just last night we were talking with our friend who runs the construction company, and he was saying that any memory he has takes him back to the place of that memory. So if he had a conversation with somebody, the way that he remembers details of that conversation is to go back to the place in his mind, and different people's brains work different ways. So you just kind of iterate throughout the interview and find, okay, what's going to connect with this particular interviewee? How does their brain work? Do they need reminders of place, of weather? There are all kinds of various contexts that might jog somebody's memory.
And with the diversity training, if someone said, yeah, we did it, it didn't go too smoothly, but yeah, we've tried it. We might ask a question like, okay, so imagine that someone's making a movie of you doing that diversity training, right? Can you walk us through the scenes beat by beat? Who was there? What was the background like? Were you in a conference room, right? Like how many chairs were there? Was there a whiteboard? Just all these kind of details. What would be on the screen as we're watching the movie? What characters are there? How are they interacting, right? So just anything you can do to get the person to describe in detail what their recent past experience was. And then a few more just like tips on getting good stories. So, oh yeah, I'm gonna answer that question after I get through these few. Okay, so ask for stories and examples from direct experience until you hit the boundaries of what people know. So someone might say, oh yeah, we've tried this, all the time. We've tried a dozen diversity trainings at my company. And we'd say, great, can you give us 3 recent examples of it? And they might give 1 recent example, and then we'd say, cool, can you give us another? What was that second story? And sometimes they can't. And so we ask follow-up. I just realized there might be 2 ways to interpret the most recent question. But yeah, so we'll ask 2 to 3 follow-up questions to try to jog the person's memory, and then we just let them off the hook. So we don't just like hound them until they tell us what they want, what we want them to know. Interviews are obviously about building a lot of rapport. So yeah, so Art, I'm gonna get back to that question in a minute. But yeah, just these last couple of tips on getting good stories. So ask questions that begin with who, what, why, when, where, and how. So I'm going to repeat that. So they're familiar, but who, what, why, when, where, and how. Questions that begin with that are usually open and invite people to talk about past behavior, right? And then it's really good to avoid questions that begin with would, is, or are. Would, is, and are invite the interviewee to speculate. So we want to frame the questions to get them talking about the recent past. So those are quick ways to just check, like, do some quality assurance, like, yes, we're actually asking questions that are going to be helpful and predictive of customers' future behavior. And then when it comes to recording interviews, to Art's question.
Mhm. And then we'll go to Gavin's too.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I missed that one from Gavin. So yeah, we don't usually record unless we need to. So if there are two of us sitting in on the interviews, we'll divide it up. And I'm just fielding these since I was only talking about it.
Yeah.
And one of us will take the role of lead interviewer. So that person will just ask the questions and make sure we're paying attention very closely to like little threads we can pull on and follow up. And then the other person takes copious notes.
And we do that on paper and using a pen, super old school, because interviewees can hear if you're typing, and computers are such distraction machines anyway. It's much easier to stay focused and signal to the interviewee, I'm actually listening to what you're saying, and I'm not checking my email, and
Right.
I'm not, doing other things if they can't hear you typing away.
Yeah. And we found it's a lot easier to interview, especially if you haven't done it much before. It's a lot easier with two people because the second person will notice things that the first person misses. Just like anything with innovation, if you have more minds paying attention, it's going to help. And then now that we're comfortable with it and have done it like hundreds of times, we'll do it solo, and that's okay. We've recorded interviews sometimes, but here's the catch. Like, it seems like legally and ethically, it's good to let the person know that they're being recorded. And if you're asking a person, especially if it's customer discovery for like, what sweater do you want to buy? I don't think anyone's going to be too worried about that. But if you're asking them to give you information about how they make purchasing decisions at their organization, or what went wrong when they had a meeting with someone else at their company, a lot of people just clam up when they know they're being recorded. And if they are not thinking about being recorded, they're a lot more forthcoming. So there are times when we've known this person's going to deluge us with information. There's only one of us, we can't keep up. We'll ask them to record. But we found often that just shuts people down.
Mm-hmm.
So it's best to avoid it if possible.
Yeah. And every single set of interviews I've conducted, people ask, are you taking notes? How are you saving this information? What are you doing with this information? Who's going to see this information? Because a lot of our questions get at complaints people have about their boss or, things within their organization. And people don't want that to be public.
Yeah.
And what we need is good information. And so if people aren't willing to share that, then it's a waste of time for everybody. So whatever you can do to set up a safe environment and let them know, like, this is for internal purposes only. I'm literally taking notes with a pen and paper. Only, me and my co-founder are going to look at this, that kind of thing. Generally really puts people at ease.
Yeah. And then Gavin had a question too.
Yes, up here.
What methods do you use to continually validate or maybe even pivot off of your existing customer profiles as you move through your phases? Great question. So after we finish each interview, not only do we jot down what we could have done better as interviewers and what questions people misunderstood and what they raised that might inspire new interesting questions, we also jot down notes at the top where we'll end up feeding a custom lead scoring algorithm. So we don't need to geek out on that and go into the weeds on it, but what we do is we'll say, okay, what features does this person have? So I'll just go with the top of mind example with the digital healthcare startup. I would just write down, okay, huge health system, $5 billion plus revenue per year. Here's the person's job title. Here's how long they've been in the role. Here is their education level. Here's their location. Are they rural? Are they urban? All these kinds of things, just anything we can think of that might be an interesting attribute. And then as we've interviewed more and more potential customers in that cocktail party, we start to go, oh, okay, this is interesting. Like, it's all the people who are in urban hospitals that start just telling us stories about how problematic this is. So let's see if that hypothesis is true and start trying to interview more people at urban hospitals and health systems. So that can be really casual. We have a very formal decision science-y model that we build, but But that can be a really casual process where you're just like jotting down everything you can notice about the person. And then when you do that with, more than 3 people, you can start to notice patterns.
I've got a new question. Do you keep them anonymous? If so, how do you keep track of them / their information without getting confused with other people? Do you find they're more comfortable knowing if they will be on record or not?
Good question.
So we do we print out our interview questions with space for us to write. And at the top of that, we put the person's name, generally the company, how we found the contact. And then, we take notes on that. So we don't anonymize it at the Jonathan and my evaluation level because it helps us to keep track of things. But we do anonymize it if we're sharing that information with anyone else.
Right. And we'll email people, we send them follow-up thank yous. And so we can't, I think, the logistics of interviewing people totally anonymously, where we don't even know who they are or what they're doing, I think would just be totally prohibitive. But yeah, we haven't had people say, I don't want to be on record or off record. We haven't interviewed politicians. So might be different, but most people I think are just not used to relating with the media, and they don't see us as the media. So once they find out we're just doing some simple research and we're curious what they're frustrated with in their job, usually they're just like, yeah, I'll tell you all kinds of stuff.
And there's no sense in which they could be on record with it. Like there is no, people do want to know, is my information going to be made public? So if on record is the cue for that, people are curious about that, and we tell them no, this is not going to be public.
We shred our notes.
Yeah. So in that sense, they are off the record, and we're not journalists. So
yeah. And I'm wondering, we have a couple of tips if they're helpful.
Couple more, and then we should jump into the exercise.
Definitely.
We don't have much time.
Yeah.
Okay, so notice subtle comments during the interviews that imply that there might be more to learn, and be sure to pull on those threads. So let's say an interviewee says, I didn't like that sweater, so I bought this one instead. What didn't they like about that sweater? And what did they like about the one that they ended up purchasing? So you might say, you might be asking about why, but they say something about X. Make a note in your notes about X and come back and say, hey, you mentioned something about X. I just want to follow up on that. Because those can be really great sources of information. And then make sure you understand. Again, relationship advice 101. If you couldn't explain what they said to a friend who wasn't there, you don't get it. And so reflect back, say, am I understanding you correctly? When you said this, did you mean this? Interviews are about learning what customers believe and how they behave. So this is not the time to try to convince them of anything. This is not the time to try to reach consensus. It's just, that's not what this is for.
Yeah. And it's hard. It's hard when sometimes you're like, I've talked with 50 people in your industry, right? And I know that what you're saying is not true. We'll still just be like, oh, that's really interesting. Why do you believe that's true? Are there stories that you can tell us that back that up? So it's all about empathy, just understanding the other person, which also is nice to get you off the hook. Like, you don't have to share anything about yourself in these interviews, which is kind of amazing in a conversation, just to be like, tell me more. I just want to understand you, our relationships like off the hook when we're interviewing, because we're doing that with each other. We're also married, not just like, we don't just work together. Okay, should we do the exercise?
Yes.
Okay.
So just a little setup, right?
Yep, little setup and exercise, and then just Q&A, if that's cool. Does that sound all right, Meg? Okay, cool. So if everyone has a pen and paper, if you don't have one, or something to write with, please grab one. And I just realized how old school saying pen and paper is. Okay, think about a product or service that you have bought in the last month. So this could be a sweater, it could be an app subscription, it could be a specific course at Western. Maybe we were too late in the term for that. And this should be something you had to think about a little. So it's not just automatic. It's not like the cup of coffee you always order, right? This is something you had to think through a little bit. Just bring that to mind and write it down. I'm just gonna give you 10 seconds to jot it down. And there's no wrong answer or any of that. Okay, cool. So we're gonna do a breakout session. And yeah, Meg, that's right. 10 minutes, 5 people per room. And I am going to throw a document, a file in the chat thread, so we can do a super simple mock interview. So what we'll do is one person who remembers their purchasing decision clearly can be the interviewee, right? Who's going to tell everyone about the product that they purchased. And then another person is going to be a lead interviewer. So they can just literally go through the PDF we share and ask the questions. You don't have to come up with anything off the top, right? And the PDF just includes like a random sampling of questions that can be helpful in interviews. And then everyone else in the group, jump in to ask clarifying questions and make sure you can understand the details well enough to explain this person's product adoption process afterward. So that's the exercise. I'm gonna put this document in here, just one sec. Here. Okay. Let's make sure this is right. All right, cool. There it is. If you don't get through all the questions, that's totally fine. This is more just an exercise in asking questions and making it entirely about the one interviewee, excuse me. Is that cool?
Then we'll come back for Q&A.
Yeah.
Whoa, are we the only ones back?
Apparently.
Yeah.
So we can talk through some questions in just a minute, but just a couple of quick comments first. So hopefully you noticed that people are happy to answer questions. And imagine doing that with 5 interviews, 25, 100 interviews. That's when you can really start to see patterns in the market, what people want, how they make decisions. So that's what we're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
A couple things that came up just in our breakout room that I really enjoyed watching was the interviewees. We had a couple due to a technical issue, and the interviewees both responded in a human way. So, you know, our interviewee would answer a question and then the interviewer would say, "Oh, cool, thanks," and then go on to the question. And we find that kind of just human feedback is really useful in keeping things sort of casual and friendly, so that you get more openness.
Mm-hmm. And should we, were there any questions that came up from the breakout rooms or anything we talked about earlier?
I just want to say those questions are awesome.
Oh, thanks.
Thanks.
Like fantastic. Like work for any product. Really cool.
What'd you like about them?
Well, I was being interviewed and I just had a lot of fun like answering the questions. Like I thought they really made me think. Like they were kind of surprising and how much depth I was able to go into.
Yeah.
Like remembering the exact moment I decided I needed this law of attraction planner. It's kind of funny.
Thanks.
So.
On a scale of 0 to 10, how likely are you to recommend those questions to a friend?
Just
10.
Cool. Looks like we have a couple questions on the. Let's ask questions about the quality of the questions being asked about the questions.
Good.
So one of the things that came up in our breakout session too was that some of the questions get at the same topics from multiple angles. So, and was that intentional? So we could talk about that too. And the answer is yes. Often it's just people won't respond to question number 3 in any interesting way, but number 5 hits them just right. And so we're trying to just pull the information out of people however it can land, so it's, I think, okay to be redundant. Often we'll be like, okay, seems like you answered this, but just to double check, is there anything you have to add on, blah, blah, blah. Right. So yeah, I think that answers that.
I want to follow up with Art later on the 6.
I-
That's like I'm assuming it was the NPS answer.
Oh,
on
right.
a scale of 1 to 10 about the questions. I want to learn how to improve them.
Yeah,
But 6
same.
is not good enough.
Yeah, we need 8 or above. Or
I have a quick question about timing for these interviews.
yeah.
Do you find that there's like a sweet spot, like 10 to 15 minutes or like an hour to 2 hours for these, or do you think it differs for each one for different stages in the interview process?
Yeah. Should I have an answer? Do you have it?
Please go ahead.
Okay, cool. So we always ask for 10-minute interviews. And that usually helps people say yes. And I think in I don't know how many hundreds of interviews we've done or advised, or thousands at this point we've advised. We've had one person who said, okay, I'm setting a timer, and they were very antagonistic. And everybody else just rolled with it. And so, we in the early cocktail party interviews, often there'll be 15 or 20 minutes and we'll just kind of learn, okay, this isn't really an interesting direction. And we won't say that, obviously. But we'll just say, thank you so much for your time. It's been really helpful, and we look forward to being in touch. And in the later stages where we're going into depth with the right people on the types of progress they're trying to make and what's the competition, features and all of that, we still ask for 10-minute interviews, but people usually talk for more around 45 minutes. We've had interviewees whom we've had to cut off because it's been 2.5 hours and we have to do other things. And they just really like talking, but which is a great problem to have, right? You're just asking someone to tell you how to improve what you're doing and they won't stop talking. So, but usually we plan, we ask for 10 minutes, we block off an hour or 90 minutes on our calendar, just in case it's running long. And they usually run about 45 minutes once we're going in depth. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that is amazing. I really appreciate it. Thank you. And I have a follow-up question also.
Yeah.
How do you find people to interview? Do you generally I know that in this class when we're connecting with people to do our surveys and stuff, it often feels like we're exhausting our personal networks.
Mm-hmm.
I know at least all my friends were like, please stop sending me survey links. So I'm curious, how do you find people to interview?
Yeah. Should I?
Go
Okay.
for it.
So this gets at what we call an interview mix as well. So I'm going to answer a question that's implied by that and then get back to the question itself. Yeah. So we find that it can be helpful to interview up to 6 people and no more than that. So we call them warm interviews. So where we try to get introductions to people in various industries, if we don't know them directly, or if it's just like a consumer-facing product or organization, whatever, just ask friends, whatever, just easiest low-hanging fruit. Who can you get to talk to you who isn't interviewed out, right? But people want to preserve relationships. So one mistake I made, I think ChoiceMap is top of mind, this digital healthcare startup. One mistake I made is I interviewed 15 people who Cedars-Sinai had invested in our company, the hospital in LA. And then executives at Cedars-Sinai are very influential in the healthcare industry. And they introduced us to a bunch of people and said, this is a company we've invested in. Will you talk with them? And everyone was like, yeah, we'll talk with them for sure. Right. And then all of those people told us everything we wanted to hear because they didn't want to burn their bridges with Cedars. And the interviews were totally useless. They were very kind that built our networks, but they didn't tell us what we needed to learn, which was that people didn't want to buy this product, right? So cold interviews are a lot more helpful. So in a time when it's not COVID, you can literally go ask people on the street. You can go to coffee shops and walk around. we like if anyone on the thread wants to chat about this, we can talk about how to do it in a lot more detail when everyone's not on the thread, but we end up cold emailing a lot of people, and we just tell them like, hey, we're trying to talk with people who have XYZ problem. We're not trying to sell anything to make it explicit. Our goal is just to learn. And so we're wondering if you'd be open to talking with us for 10 minutes. And what we found is that if we've actually hit on a value proposition or type of progress that people want to make, response rate's pretty high. And if it's not something that people are interested in, response rate's super low. So that's an early signal, even before you start interviewing. Can you get people to start saying, yes, I want to talk to you about this because it's annoying and frustrating, and if you can help solve it, great.
And we do cold emails most frequently, but I've sat at a coffee shop, at various coffee shops or libraries or college campuses with a sign that literally says like, will you come talk with me about X? And people will just come sit down. And it's like, it's a social experiment. It's interesting.
Yeah.
Who comes and who looks at you like, what on earth are you doing?
Yeah.
But it can be really useful.
Totally. Does that answer the question?
Yes, thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it.
Cool.
We have a few in the chat too.
Okay.
So how do you find people to interview? We just covered, personally, I'm struggling to find people to interview due to the pandemic, and I was wondering how you navigate this online. Yeah. So the great thing about cold email interviews is that the pandemic doesn't impact it. And we prefer to do phone call interviews that we initiate, because if you set up like a Zoom meeting or something, oftentimes people are late, or it's at their sort of, it puts the ball in their court, and we prefer to be the one dialing at the minute. And then people will pick up. And then if you're doing a phone interview, you don't need to worry about the camera situation and them watching you take notes or anything like that. So we go about it that way. And thankfully the pandemic doesn't impact that.
Okay, another question about, there are kind of a lot here, so we might need to be quick. Question about the cocktail interviews. How structured are those? Do you have a list of questions, play it by ear, or do a hybrid? And kind of on a scale of casual conversation on the bus to sit down interview. Okay, so top of my thoughts, is that?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So with the interview mix, when it's warm contacts and people you already know or someone you know introduced you to this person, we usually are very casual about that, and just chat and say like, okay, what don't we know about your industry? Here's some jargon we're confused about, right? Like just get all the low-hanging fruit. Just say we have dumb questions that we need someone to answer. Can you tell us about that? And we're just casual. We'll jot down what we want to learn in advance and then try to make sure we ask questions about that.
But usually no more than like 5 questions.
Yep.
Pretty short for those warm interviews.
And then for everything else, including cocktail interviews, we create what we call interview guides. And so those are lists of questions. And we literally like add lines, because we do all this on paper with pen, right? And so there are lines under each question. And then, so it'll be, in the past 3 months, have you tried any diversity training at your organization? And then there are like 10 lines. And then under that, the guide is like, it's algorithmic. And so for us, it's very structured. So it might say, if no diversity trainings in past 3 months, skip to 7, if yes, in the past 3 months, continue to 3, so that we can just follow it really quickly on the fly. That's probably overkill for a lot of things, but we do this for a living. So we have big systems set up for it,
And just along those lines, one really helpful thing with interview guides is we read them aloud to each other before we ever conduct our first interview, because that helps you make it more natural language.
Yeah.
There can be some pretty awkward phrasing that we will come up with in writing, and then you read it aloud and are like, oh geez, what was I thinking?
Yeah.
And it's just really easy to make quick edits to that really improve the flow of the interview. I also wanted to make sure we jumping back to Emma's question about ways to approach people via Facebook or other media platforms. We do sometimes use Facebook ads to get interviews. That's usually lower on our list, and it's usually only if we need to confirm. It's usually if we get really low response rates via our other methods, then we will try to confirm the fact that this value proposition is a no-go by doing Facebook ads for interviews. But we don't generally, that's not a frequent thing for us.
And a quick note on the interview guides too, jumping back, sorry, we're going back and forth here. But usually what we'll do to set them up is we'll say at the beginning, here are the things where we put ourselves out there first, right? So we'll say, hi, so-and-so, it's great to connect with you. Again, my name is Jonathan, this is Rebecca. We're wondering if we could set up, tell you a little bit about what we're working on, and then ask you a few questions. Is that okay with you? So we're constantly asking for people's permission to talk and then keeping them in the loop so that they're not just wondering. So we'll say, yeah, we're exploring a product that can do diversity training at corporations. We don't have anything to sell yet, but we're in the early stages of planning for that, right? And so we're wondering if we can ask you a few questions related to that. And that helps people if we volunteer first, even if it's simple and short, and we usually keep it simple and short, then people are a lot more likely to volunteer with us, right? So we're not just diving in and saying, okay, talk at us, right? So yeah.
I just had a thought that went away. It'll come back, but let's go on in the meantime.
Okay.
Let's see.
Thanks for the encouragement, Art. We really appreciate it.
This question did that one. How do you get the cold email lists? Okay. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay. And work through employers too. So part of this is what type of people you're trying to contact, right? So usually our clients are doing B2B or B2E, like business to enterprise sales. And so they're trying to figure out like, okay, do accountants at this type of company have this sort of value proposition that's unmet, right? So, and then obviously there's like B2C, business to consumer, or B2NP, business to nonprofit, or B2G, business to government, like whatever kind of jargon you want to throw out there. If it's B2C, there are certain approaches, and if it's B2B or B to some other organization, there are various types of approaches. So we build our email lists in a software called Apollo, which can be kind of, they have some free trials and give you some free emails, and you can just filter down and say, we only want to target people who are at organizations with between 1 million and 100 million in revenue, who are located in the United States, people who have this type of job title, all that kind of stuff. It'll just spit out their emails.
The thing about Apollo is that their email lists are not super accurate. So we do a lot of QAing, quality assurance is, if that is familiar. So we do a lot of manual checking. It's time consuming. We make sure that the people are actually still working at the companies that Apollo thinks they're working at. Because if you're sending out a lot of emails like we do, and your emails are getting blocked frequently, then your email domain can get a bad reputation, and that can be a problem. So that's one thing to note about that device.
And we're kind of, I mean, we're talking about how we do this, and we do this for a living. So it's kind of like the heavier hitting things. Yeah. Let's say you're just trying to find out something about Bellingham, right? You're like, we have a product that we might want to launch to Bellingham restaurateurs. Okay, cool. Like, go on Google Maps, make a list of all the restaurants you can find in Bellingham, and then just start searching LinkedIn for like managers at those restaurants, right? Or start Googling like contact information for this restaurant and contact information for that restaurant. And it's a little time consuming to build a list that way. But most of the time people want to help out, and you all have this great shortcut, which is that you can say, I'm a student, right? Or I'm a professor at Western. And I'm a student, I'm trying to understand this sort of thing as part of an entrepreneurial program. And you're gonna get a way higher response rate. So at one point we hired a friend who's an ethnographer at Princeton, and he and I both sent out a bunch of cold contact emails. And his response rate, I was the CEO of the company at the time, and he was just like, I'm saying just the hired hand. He knew way more about interviewing than I did at that point. So like just the hired hand who's an expert ethnographer. And because he was emailing from an academic email address, I think his response rate was like twice as high as mine, because people actually believed him when he said, I'm not trying to sell you anything. So right now, that's a good thing to use to your advantage. You could say, I'm a student, I'm just trying to learn about this thing, Bellingham restaurateur or whatever, you know?
People use the term research. People like to help students. People like to help researchers. It doesn't feel salesy.
1 or 2 more questions. I'm going to check Apollo. Let's see, Apollo HQ. I'm going to see if this link is right.
I think it's apollo.io.
Yep. Any other questions just while I'm pulling that up?
It is, let's see, how do you get the cold email list? How do you find interviewees when your target market has low trust in other similar businesses already?
Well, let's see.
Do you mind giving an example? I'm not quite sure I understand that question yet.
Where is this?
It's so I'm starting a venture doing one-on-one mentor sessions to teach people how to day trade stocks.
Okay.
And there's so much noise in the advertising space already, because everyone's trying to sell you this get rich quick lifestyle when that's, you know, that's not what it is, but there's so much of that. And so people have been really turned off from that. And I'm having trouble finding avenues to get interviewees because everyone just blocks me on social media when I reach out.
Yeah, that sounds challenging.
It does. I would try, rather than using social media, I would try the cold email approach and explain. That gives you a couple of paragraphs. You know, we try to keep our emails relatively short, but gives you a couple of paragraphs to explain exactly what you're doing, and to say, you can just say explicitly, this is not a get rich quick scheme. And I am just trying to learn blah, blah, blah. I think that might help.
And it might be worth avoiding any language that has get rich quick in it. It might go straight to spam. But if you say, to make it explicit, my goal is to learn, not to sell anything, I'm a student, right? Then that might help. And emailing might, I'm just seconding that. Maybe that's duplicative. I think one thing to keep in mind is that markets for products can be attractive or unattractive for a lot of reasons. But 2 criteria that we use when we're analyzing opportunities is, how big is this market, right? And for a lot of obvious reasons. Also, how cohesive is this market? And cohesion tells you how quickly you could diffuse to the market, right? So if a lot of customers in a market talk to each other and share information about products, that's a way more attractive market than a market where everyone's really steely and cold and doesn't want anyone from the outside to come in, right? And they don't talk to each other because they want to hold their advantages. That can make it a lot harder to get products adopted, even if the market is huge. So we kind of multiply those things by each other, right? Because that'll tell us a lot about the market in a shorthand way. Mm-hmm. So like, it would be worth trying these other avenues and seeing, can you get email contact? But if you can't, and I'm not trying to be a downer, but like often we'll just, for clients or for ourselves too, with businesses we're starting, we'll just say, okay, we've tried these multiple avenues and we just can't get anyone to respond. Like that's a signal right there. That's not noise, that's a signal. So, and it, like, obviously there are a lot of things to try, and I'm not trying to harsh on what you're doing. It sounds awesome. But it is worth paying attention, you know, because if it's not possible to get people's attention and have them say yes now, that might be worth listening to in the long run too. Hope that wasn't discouraging. I think it's, yeah.
All right.
Anything else?
Helpful.
This was so amazing. So if everybody could do us a favor and open up their chat thread, and let's type in there something that you're gonna take forward from today. And yes, this will in some iteration also be a question in attendance, but it's so great to see them live action. So something you're thankful for out of this talk, something that jumped out to you, something you're gonna take away from today.
Thank you all so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Gosh, this is so amazing. What a fantastic gift.
And while you're all doing that too, our contact info is on the PDF that you all had with the questions has both of our emails. So please do get in touch with us. We're happy to help. Just remind us you were in the class and we'd love to help.
Yeah, with customer discovery or the tech world, startup world, any of it. Yeah.
Thank you. So many great things coming in. Here we go. Finding interviewees, great interview questions. Yes, yes, yes. Cold emails are great to utilize. Hey, you guys are awesome. Listen to your initial interviews, literally everything. Love you, Olivia. Ideas on how to get good results. Real tangible advice is so valuable. Ideas of psychology behind successful interviews. Ask questions about past behavior, not future predictions. Super great. Use framework of stories. You're super cool and knowledgeable. How to elaborate interview questions. Amazing, amazing, amazing stories. Learning how your customers think. This was so information rich, being a human in an interview. Awesome. This was so great. Super loud. Appreciate you both. And I think you'll have a lot of students very eager to connect with you for learning and insights. So this was super fantastic. Thank you so much for today and the opportunity to connect.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. Thanks for giving us your attention.
Yeah.
That's a gift. So yeah, we're grateful.
All right. Good luck with
All right.
midterms.
Yeah, hope they go well.
Thank you. Take care.
You
Bye.
too. Bye.